Picture this: rubber tanks, fake armies, sound trucks playing recordings of soldiers that didn't exist, and a group of artists, actual painters, sculptors, fashion designers, sent to the front lines of World War II with one mission: deceive the enemy so completely that thousands of real soldiers could survive. This actually happened, and for 50 years, nobody knew. Now, before we dive into this, grab yourself a coffee, maybe some tea, settle back into your seat, because what you're about to hear, it's going to change how you think about war, about deception, about what really won the battles in Europe. This is one of those stories that sounds too strange to be true, but every single word of it, documented, verified, real. So if you enjoy learning about the hidden chapters of history, go ahead and hit that subscribe button, because we're going deep into one of the most classified operations of the Second World War. You ready? Let's begin. June 1944. The beaches of Normandy are still soaked with blood. The Allied forces have just punched through Hitler's Atlantic Wall, and now comes the hard part: pushing across France, liberating towns, villages, pushing the Germans back toward their homeland. But here's the problem, and it's a massive one. The Germans, they still have numbers. They still have panzer divisions, artillery, experience. Every time the Allies want to make a real push, a real offensive, they risk losing thousands of men. Thousands. Boys who left farms in Iowa, shops in Brooklyn, factories in Birmingham, sent across an ocean to fight a monster. And the generals, they know this. Eisenhower knows this. Bradley knows this. Patton, for all his bluster, he knows it too. So they need an edge. Not just better tanks, not just more planes. They need something the Germans won't see coming. They need magic. Or, well, the closest thing to magic that exists in warfare. They need deception on a scale never attempted before. And that's where they come in. The Ghost Army. The 23rd Headquarters Special Troops. 1,100 men. Average age, about 23 years old. And here's the thing that makes this so remarkable, so utterly strange. Most of them weren't soldiers. Not really. They were artists. Let me paint you a picture of who these men were before the war found them. Bill Blass. Yeah, that Bill Blass, the fashion designer, he was there. Ellsworth Kelly, the famous painter whose work now hangs in museums around the world, he was there too. Art Kane, the photographer who'd go on to shoot some of the most iconic images of the 20th century, there. Fashion designers, painters, illustrators, sculptors, sound engineers from radio stations and Hollywood studios, architects, ad men from Madison Avenue. The Army went looking for creative minds, people who understood illusion, perspective, shadow, light. People who could sell a lie so convincing that trained German intelligence officers, hardened by years of war, would believe it completely. And they were recruited, quietly, very quietly. Most of them had no idea what they were signing up for. They'd get a letter or a visit, someone in uniform asking strange questions. Can you paint? Can you draw? Do you understand how sound works? How light and shadow create depth? And if you answered yes, if you had that spark of creativity, you might find yourself on a train heading to Camp Forest in Tennessee, then to Fort Meade in Maryland, being taught things that seem to have nothing to do with winning a war. How to sew canvas, how to inflate rubber with air compressors, how to splice audio tape, how to send fake radio transmissions. Strange, right? But stay with me. The concept behind the Ghost Army, it came from a British magician. Yeah, you heard that right. Jasper Maskelyne, a stage magician from London, had convinced British command that illusion, real theatrical illusion, could be weaponized. He'd done it in North Africa, hiding the Suez Canal with lights and mirrors, making tanks disappear, creating fake Alexandria to draw German bombers away from the real city. The British saw it work. The Americans heard about it. And they thought, we need that. We need that desperately. So the 23rd Headquarters Special Troops was born in January 1944. 1,100 men divided into 4 main units. You had the 603rd Camouflage Engineers, the visual deception guys, the ones handling the inflatable tanks, the dummy artillery. Then the 3132nd Signal Service Company, the radio deception specialists, creating entire fake communication networks. The 406th Combat Engineers, who handled the sonic deception, the sound trucks, the recordings. And the Signal Company Special, more radio trickery, more phantom communications. Together, they had one job: make the Germans think the American army was somewhere it wasn't. Now, let's talk about the equipment, because this is where it gets really interesting. The inflatables. These weren't party balloons shaped like tanks. These were detailed, carefully constructed replicas made from rubberized canvas. A Schumann tank, the real thing, weighs about 30 tons. 30 tons of steel, armor, engine, treads. The inflatable version weighed about 100 pounds. 100 pounds. 2 men could carry one. They'd roll it out, attach an air compressor, and in about 15 minutes, there's your tank. From a distance, from the air, through binoculars, through the haze of war, it looked real. The shadows were right. The proportions were correct. Even the markings, the unit designations painted on the side, authentic. They had inflatable trucks, jeeps, artillery pieces, even airplanes. An entire fake arsenal that could be packed into a few vehicles and moved in the middle of the night. But the visual deception, that was just the beginning. The Germans, they weren't stupid. They had reconnaissance planes, they had spies, they had intelligence networks that had been operating since the First World War. A few rubber tanks sitting in a field wouldn't fool anyone long. So the Ghost Army had to sell it completely. And that's where the sonic deception came in. The 406th Combat Engineers, they had these sonic cars, half-tracks, armored vehicles mounted with massive speakers. And these weren't just any speakers. These were directional, powerful, could project sound up to 15 miles. 15 miles! Think about that. And what were they playing? Recordings. Actual recordings made at real army bases back in the States. The sound of tank engines starting, idling, moving across terrain. The sound of trucks convoying, dozens of them, grinding through gears. The sound of soldiers, hundreds of them, talking, shouting orders, equipment being loaded and unloaded, bridges being built, pontoons being deployed. All of it recorded, mixed, edited by sound engineers who knew exactly how these things should sound, how sound travels at night, how it bounces off valleys, how weather affects it. They'd roll these sonic cars up to the front lines, sometimes within a few miles of German positions, and at night, in the dark, they'd play these recordings, and the Germans would hear it. They'd hear what sounded like an entire armored division moving into position. Tanks, trucks, infantry, engineers, a major force massing for an attack. And they'd report it. German intelligence officers would mark it on their maps. Commanders would shift troops to counter it. Artillery would be repositioned. Reserves would be called up. All based on a recording played through speakers from the back of a truck. And the radio deception, this might have been the most sophisticated part of the whole operation. The 3132nd Signal Service Company, these guys were brilliant. They understood how military communication worked, how units talked to each other, how commanders coordinated movements. So they created fake radio traffic, entire fake networks. They'd set up transmitters and start broadcasting using call signs, code words, procedures that matched real units. They'd send fake orders, fake status reports, fake supply requests. Phantom divisions would check in. Phantom reconnaissance patrols would report enemy positions. Phantom quartermaster units would request fuel, ammunition, rations for thousands of men who didn't exist. And here's the really clever part. They'd mimic real units. They'd study how a specific division communicated, the rhythm of their transmissions, the quirks of their radio operators, even how their commander spoke. Then they'd copy it perfectly. So when they wanted to make the Germans think the 4th Armored Division was in one location, they'd move in, set up, and start broadcasting as if they were the 4th Armored. Meanwhile, the real 4th Armored Division? miles away, moving quietly into position for an actual attack somewhere else. Radio silence, complete radio silence. And the Germans, listening to all this chatter, all this fake radio traffic, they'd think the 4th Armored was over there, preparing for an assault, and they'd move their forces to meet a threat that didn't exist. The Ghost Army ran its first operation in June 1944, just weeks after D-Day. Operation Elephant. Normandy was still a mess. The Bulge country, those hedgerows, they were grinding up infantry units, turning every field into a killing ground. The Allies needed to break out, needed to make the Germans think there were more forces than there actually were. So the Ghost Army moved in. They set up near Saint-Lô, inflated tanks and artillery, played their recordings, broadcast their radio traffic. The Germans saw it, heard it, believed it. They held forces in place to counter an attack that never came. Meanwhile, the real American units hit them somewhere else. It worked. Operation Brest, September 1944. The port city of Brest, in Brittany. The Germans had 40,000 troops dug in there, and the Allies needed that port desperately. Supplies, reinforcements, everything came through ports. But laying siege to Brest, that would tie up forces needed for the push into Germany. So the Ghost Army came in. They made the Germans think there were 2 full divisions surrounding the city instead of 1. Inflatables, sound effects, radio chatter. The German commander in Brest, he saw what he thought was overwhelming force. He surrendered. 40,000 men surrendered to a force half the size they thought they were facing, and part of that force didn't even exist. But the biggest operation, the one that really proved what the Ghost Army could do, that was Operation Viersen, March 1945. The Rhine River, the last major natural barrier between the Allies and the heart of Germany. Crossing the Rhine, that was going to cost lives, lots of lives. The Germans knew it was coming. They were dug in on the eastern bank. Artillery zeroed in on likely crossing points, machine gun nests, mines, the works. The 9th Army was going to make the crossing at Viersen, but they needed the Germans to think the crossing was happening somewhere else. Enter the Ghost Army. They moved north near the town of Viersen, and they created an entire fake buildup. Tanks, trucks, artillery, supplies, command posts, field hospitals, the whole thing. They inflated hundreds of pieces of equipment. They played their recordings non-stop, the sound of bridge building, boat launching, massive troop movements. They broadcast radio traffic for 2 full divisions, thousands of men all preparing to cross the Rhine at Viersen. They even had real soldiers, a few hundred of them, moving around in the open, wearing the patches of these fake divisions, driving around in jeeps, acting busy. From the air, from German observation posts, it looked like a massive force gathering. And the Germans bought it, completely. They moved artillery to cover Viersen, they positioned panzer units to counterattack there, they reinforced the riverbank defenses at Viersen, they were ready for an assault that never came. And while they were focused on this phantom army, the real 9th Army, they crossed the Rhine 30 miles south. Lighter defenses, less artillery, fewer tanks. They got across with far fewer casualties than expected. Thousands of men came home because of rubber tanks and sound effects and fake radio chatter. But the Ghost Army ran 21 operations in total. They operated in France, Luxembourg, Belgium, Germany. They were at the Battle of the Bulge, that desperate winter of '44 when the Germans launched their last major offensive. The Ghost Army was there, creating fake units, making the Germans think American reinforcements were arriving in places they weren't, buying time for real units to move into position. They were part of Operation Market Garden, that disastrous attempt to capture bridges in Holland. They were with Patton's 3rd Army, racing across France. Every major operation, every major battle in the European theater after June '44, the Ghost Army played a role. And here's what's remarkable. They were effective, ridiculously effective. Intelligence reports after the war, documents captured from German command, they showed that German intelligence had identified and tracked dozens of American divisions and units that simply didn't exist. The Germans thought the Americans had far more forces in Europe than they actually did. They made strategic decisions, moved troops, allocated resources based on false information fed to them by 1,100 artists with rubber tanks and speakers. And the casualties? This is important. This is what makes this story more than just a clever trick. The Ghost Army's operations, when analyzed after the war, it's estimated they saved between 15,000 and 30,000 Allied lives. 15 to 30,000. Sons, brothers, fathers, husbands. Men who came home, who got to grow old, have families, live their lives. Because somewhere in France or Belgium or Germany, a group of artists set up inflatable tanks and played recordings and sent fake radio messages that made the Germans shoot at ghosts instead of real soldiers. But it wasn't safe. Don't think for a second this was some cushy assignment away from the fighting. These men, they operated close to the front lines, sometimes within artillery range. They had to set up their deceptions where the Germans could see them, hear them. That meant danger, real danger. They took casualties. Men died. Jack Massey, one of the Ghost Army soldiers, he later talked about nights spent setting up equipment while German shells were landing close enough to feel the concussion, about being strafed by German fighters who spotted their convoys, about the constant fear that the Germans would figure out what they were doing, would realize these weren't real units, and would come looking for them. And the secrecy around the Ghost Army, it was intense. These men weren't allowed to tell anyone what they did. Not their families, not their friends, not even other soldiers. They'd come back from an operation, maybe they'd just spent 3 days pretending to be the 5th Armored Division, setting up hundreds of fake tanks, playing recordings all night, dodging artillery fire, and they couldn't talk about it. They'd see other units, real combat units, and those soldiers would have no idea what the Ghost Army did. Even after the war ended, after Germany surrendered, after Japan surrendered, after everyone came home, they still couldn't talk about it. Classified, top secret. The entire operation remained classified until 1996. 1996, more than 50 years after the war ended. Think about that for a moment. These men, they carried this secret for half a century. They went to reunions, Memorial Day ceremonies, Veterans Day events, and when people asked them what they did in the war, they'd give vague answers. Oh, I was in a special unit. We did some camouflage work. Nothing too exciting. Nothing too exciting. They'd helped win the war in Europe, saved thousands of lives, pulled off one of the most successful deception operations in military history, and they had to pretend it was nothing. Why the secrecy? Well, the military wanted to keep the techniques classified. They thought, correctly, that these methods might be useful in future conflicts. And they were right. The tactics developed by the Ghost Army, they were used in Korea, Vietnam, later conflicts. Inflatable decoys became standard military equipment. Electronic warfare, radio deception, sonic deception, all of it evolved from what the Ghost Army pioneered. So the classification held for decades. But in the 90s, as the men of the Ghost Army were getting older, as some were starting to pass away, there was a push to declassify the operation, to let these veterans finally tell their story, to give them the recognition they deserved. And in 1996, the Pentagon finally agreed. Documents were released, files were opened, and suddenly the world learned about this incredible unit that had hidden in plain sight for over 50 years. Rick Beyer, a documentary filmmaker, he heard about the Ghost Army and thought, this can't be real. This sounds like a movie plot. But he dug into it, started interviewing the surviving veterans, and he realized it was all true, every word of it. He made a documentary about them, wrote a book, and slowly the story started to get out. The men of the Ghost Army, now in their 80s and 90s, they could finally talk. They could tell their children, their grandchildren, what they'd actually done in the war. And the stories they told, they're fascinating. Bill Blass, the fashion designer, he talked about how surreal it was, going from designing clothes to inflating fake tanks in a French field while German artillery was landing a few hundred yards away. Ellsworth Kelly, the painter, he talked about how the experience, the way they used perspective and shadow to create illusions, it influenced his art for the rest of his life. Arthur Shilstone, another Ghost Army artist, he kept a sketchbook during the war, drew everything he saw, and those sketches are in the Smithsonian now. Art Seiden, Harold Lehner, they talked about the fear, the constant awareness that if the Germans ever caught them, ever figured out what they were doing, it would be bad. Very bad. But they also talked about the camaraderie. These were creative people, artists, thrown into a war, given this bizarre mission, and they bonded over it. They'd set up their equipment, get the operation running, and then, if they had downtime, they'd paint, they'd sketch, they'd write. Some of them kept detailed journals, even though technically they weren't supposed to. They documented the war in a way few other soldiers did. Not just the battles, but the landscapes, the villages, the people they met. The destruction, yes, but also the beauty they found in between the horror. And after the war, after they came home, many of them went on to have remarkable careers. Bill Blass became one of the most famous fashion designers in America. Ellsworth Kelly became a giant in the abstract art world. Art Kane took that famous photo, A Great Day in Harlem, all those jazz musicians on a brownstone stoop. George Vandersloot became a successful commercial artist. Jack Macy went into exhibit design, designed pavilions for World's Fairs. These men, they took what they learned in the Ghost Army, that understanding of illusion, of persuasion, of how to make people see what you want them to see, and they applied it to their peacetime careers. But here's something that doesn't get talked about enough: the psychological aspect of what they did. Think about what it means to be a soldier whose job is to create lies. You're trained your whole life that honesty, integrity, those are virtues. And then you're put in a situation where your survival and the survival of thousands of other men depends on how well you can deceive, how well you can lie. And not small lies, massive lies, strategic lies, lies that affect the course of battles, the decisions of generals, the fate of nations. That's a strange burden to carry. Some of the Ghost Army veterans talked about this in their later years, how it felt odd after the war to go back to a world where lying was wrong, where deception was frowned upon, when for years their deception had been heroic, necessary, life-saving. Jack Macy said in an interview once, "We were professional liars, and we were good at it, and it saved lives." How do you process that? And there's another layer to this. The German soldiers, on the other side, they were making decisions based on false information. They were moving into positions, concentrating forces, sometimes leaving other areas vulnerable, all because they believed what the Ghost Army was selling them. And that meant, in some cases, German soldiers died because of the deceptions. Units got caught out of position, got hit by real American forces where they weren't expecting an attack. That's war. That's the brutal calculus of it. The Ghost Army's job was to save American lives, Allied lives, and they did. But the deception, it had consequences on both sides. The ethics of deception in warfare, that's a complicated topic. The Geneva Conventions, they prohibit certain types of deception. You can't misuse the Red Cross symbol, can't fake surrender to draw the enemy into an ambush, can't pretend to be civilians. But tactical deception, making the enemy think you're stronger than you are or in a different location, that's considered acceptable. That's just war. Sun Tzu wrote about it 2,500 years ago. All warfare is based on deception. The Ghost Army, They were operating within the rules, using accepted methods. But still, there's something deeply strange about it. An army of artists, creating illusions, manipulating perception, making an enemy see things that aren't there. After the declassification, there was a push to get the Ghost Army officially recognized, to give them medals, commendations, acknowledgement of what they'd done. And there was resistance. Some people in the military establishment didn't like the idea. These weren't combat soldiers in the traditional sense. They didn't charge machine gun nests, didn't take and hold territory, didn't engage the enemy directly. They were tricksters, deceivers. Did they deserve the same recognition as infantry who fought house to house? Tankers who went head-to-head with German panzers? Paratroopers who jumped into occupied territory? The Ghost Army veterans, for the most part, they didn't make a fuss. They weren't demanding parades. They just wanted their story told. They wanted people to know what they'd done, how they'd contributed. And slowly, the recognition came. Documentaries, books, museum exhibits. The Smithsonian did a big exhibit on the Ghost Army. The National World War II Museum in New Orleans dedicated a section to them. Schools started teaching about them. And younger generations, they heard these stories and they were amazed. This actually happened? Artists defeated Nazis with rubber tanks? In 2024, 80 years after D-Day, there was finally a push in Congress to award the Ghost Army the Congressional Gold Medal, one of the highest civilian honors in America. As of now, it's still working through the legislative process, but the fact that it's being considered, that shows how far we've come in recognizing what these men did. But here's what strikes me, thinking about all this. The Ghost Army, they represent something fundamental about human conflict. War isn't just about who has more guns, more tanks, more planes. It's about intelligence, creativity, adaptability. The side that can think differently, that can come up with solutions the enemy doesn't expect, that's often the side that wins. And in World War II, the Ghost Army was that creative thinking made manifest. They took the idea that war is partly theater, partly psychological, and they ran with it. They turned deception into an art form, literally an art form. And consider the broader context. World War II is often portrayed as this straightforward conflict, good versus evil, democracy versus fascism. The Allies are the heroes, the Axis are the villains. And on a fundamental level, that's true. The Nazis were committing genocide, the Japanese were committing atrocities across Asia. Stopping them was morally necessary. But the way the war was actually won, it wasn't just about moral superiority. It was about being smarter, more innovative, more willing to try unconventional approaches. The Ghost Army is a perfect example of that. The Germans had excellent soldiers, excellent equipment, excellent tactics, but the Allies had creativity. They had people willing to think outside the box, to say, what if we use artists to create illusions on the battlefield? And that creativity, that willingness to try something new, it made a difference. There's also something poignant about artists being sent to war. Throughout history, we think of artists as sensitive souls, people who create beauty, who see the world differently. And here they were, pulled into the ugliest thing humanity does, war, and asked to use their skills not to create beauty, but to deceive, to contribute to violence by proxy. But at the same time, what they did, it was creative. It required imagination, skill, and understanding of how people perceive reality. In a strange way, it was artistic. Deadly art, but art nonetheless. And the fact that it stayed secret for so long, that adds another dimension to it. These men lived their lives carrying this incredible story, and they couldn't share it. Imagine being at a dinner party in the 60s or 70s. Someone's talking about their war experience, and you're sitting there knowing you did something arguably more unique, more impactful than almost anyone else in the room, but you can't say a word. The frustration of that, the isolation. You're part of this brotherhood, 1,100 men who shared this experience, but you can't talk about it, except with each other, and even then carefully, quietly, away from anyone who might overhear. When the story finally did come out, some of the veterans talked about the relief. Finally, they could tell their kids, their grandkids, this is what Grandpa did in the war. These are the things Grandpa saw. And those stories passed down now, they're part of the historical record, part of how we understand World War II, how we understand warfare, how we understand the role of creativity and intelligence in conflict. The Ghost Army's legacy, it goes beyond their specific operations. They proved that deception could be systematized, scaled up, made into a core military capability. After World War II, every major military in the world studied what they did. The Soviets developed their own deception doctrines, maskerovka, they called it. The British continued to refine their techniques. The Americans, they incorporated the lessons into training, into planning. Modern military operations, they almost always include some element of deception now. Fake communications, decoy equipment, misinformation campaigns. The Ghost Army pioneered all of that. And in the information age, in our current era of cyber warfare, psychological operations, social media manipulation, the Ghost Army story feels even more relevant. They were, in essence, running an information warfare campaign. They were controlling what the enemy knew, shaping the enemy's perception of reality. That's what information warfare is. And now, in the 21st century, everyone's doing it. Nations, corporations, political movements, they're all trying to shape perception, control narratives, make people believe things that may or may not be true. The Ghost Army was doing that in 1944 with rubber and speakers and radio transmitters. We're doing it now with algorithms and bots and deepfakes. The technology changed, but the principle is the same. So when you think about the Ghost Army, don't just think about rubber tanks and sound effects. Think about what they represent. They represent the power of creativity in the face of violence, the power of intelligence over brute force, the idea that sometimes the best weapon isn't a gun, it's an idea, a clever idea, executed well. And think about the men themselves, 23 years old on average, younger than that, some of them. Artists, designers, sound engineers, pulled out of their normal lives and thrown into this bizarre situation. And they adapted, they learned, they became soldiers of a sort. Not the kind who charge hills with rifles, but soldiers nonetheless, fighting a war with paintbrushes and amplifiers instead of bullets. And they were brave. Don't ever think they weren't brave. Operating near the front lines, under fire, knowing that if the enemy figured out what they were doing, they'd be in serious danger. That takes guts. And the camaraderie, the bonds they formed, those were real. You can see it in the interviews with the survivors, the way they talk about each other. 60, 70 years after the war, and they still remember their buddies, still tear up talking about the guys who didn't make it home. That bond, forged in shared danger, shared purpose, shared secrets, it doesn't fade. The Ghost Army operated for less than 2 years, 21 operations, 1,100 men. But their impact, it echoes down through the decades. Every book about World War II that includes them, every documentary, every museum exhibit, it's a reminder that war is more complicated than we sometimes think. That victory isn't always about who's stronger, it's about who's smarter, more creative, more willing to try something different. And for the men who served in the Ghost Army, who carried that secret for 50 years, who finally got to tell their story, there's a vindication in that. Recognition at last for their contribution. Acknowledgement that what they did mattered, saved lives, helped win the war. They didn't get parades when they came home. They didn't get headlines, but they got something maybe more valuable. They got to know in their hearts that they'd done something remarkable. Something that had never been done before and would never quite be done the same way again. So the next time you hear about World War II, about D-Day, the Battle of the Bulge, the crossing of the Rhine, remember the Ghost Army. Remember the artists who went to war with rubber and sound and radio waves. Remember that sometimes the greatest victories come not from the strongest punch, but from the cleverest trick. And remember that 1,100 men, most of them barely out of their teens, pulled off one of the most successful deceptions in military history and then kept quiet about it for half a century because they were told it was classified, because they understood that some secrets, they're worth keeping, even when you're dying to tell them. The Ghost Army. Artists, soldiers, deceivers, heroes. They proved that in war, as in art, perception is reality. And if you can control perception, you can control outcomes. The Germans saw armies that didn't exist, heard movements that never happened, intercepted communications from units that were phantoms, and they reacted to those phantoms. And while they were reacting, real American soldiers were hitting them somewhere else, somewhere unexpected. That's the genius of it. That's the legacy. These men are mostly gone now. The youngest Ghost Army veterans would be in their late 90s. Many have passed on. But their story, it lives. In archives, in museums, in books and films, in the memories of their families who finally learned what Grandpa really did in the war, and in military doctrines of nations around the world which still study what the Ghost Army accomplished, still use their techniques, still understand that deception, done right, can be as powerful as any weapon. War is terrible. Let's not romanticize it. Men died, both sides, families were destroyed, cities were reduced to rubble, the Holocaust happened, atrocities beyond imagination occurred. The Ghost Army operated in the context of all that horror, but within that horror, they found a way to fight that minimized casualties, that used brains instead of just bullets. And that's worth remembering, worth honoring. So, there you have it. If this kind of deep dive into history is your thing, there's plenty more where this came from. Matter of fact, I've got another video. You can check that out next by clicking up here, and I'll catch you over there.